I'd just like to welcome everyone to the Centre for Applied Educational Research session on school-based physical activity. You'll notice I'm sat in my car. That is because I've taken my child swimming and had to step in at the last minute, so at least we are practicing what we preach. We've got a fantastic afternoon with 4 presenters. Dr. Anna Chalkley, who's joining us all the way from the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, and she'll be talking about creating active schools together with Dr. Jade and Zoe Helme. And then finally, we'll finish with Dr. Liam Hill, a lecturer in developmental psychology from the University of Leeds, who will talk about physically active learning. I'll round the session off with some European work that we're doing around physical active learning before we go into an opportunity for questions from the audience. So without further ado, I will hand over to yourself, Anna.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks. If I can have the first slide. Thanks, Mallory. So yeah, as Andy said, I'm based at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, but also I'm an Associate Research Fellow at the University of Bradford and based in the UK. So maybe not quite as random as it initially sounded. My role today is to give you a whistle-stop tour of the Creating Active School framework, a project that's led within Yorkshire, a combination of a partnership between Yorkshire Sport Foundation, University of Bradford, and Bradford Teaching Hospital Foundation Trust. Bradford is one of the locality hubs for Creating Active Schools, and much of the work around Creating Active Schools to date has been trailblazed within Bradford and Yorkshire more broadly. Zoe will talk about how Creating Active Schools has been applied in Bradford, but I'm just going to give you a bit more of an overview to start with today's session. Next slide, please, Mary. So this is just a bit of an analogy which we've referred to previously, which I think illustrates the need for creating active school and a bit of the background quite well. So if you imagine that the water in the bucket represents children's physical activity levels and or opportunities to be active, we've actually had a rapid growth in research around school-based physical activity, and we have quite a good understanding about what works to promote physical activity in schools, coupled with an unprecedented funding received in the last 10 years through the school sport PE physical activity funding of £2.2 billion. So these have been topping up our water levels or our children's physical activity levels. However, opportunities for children to actually be active have been diminishing as physical activity has been engineered out of daily life. And children's physical inactivity levels have actually remained quite stubborn, with less than half of children being sufficiently active and achieving the recommended 60 minutes of physical activity per day across the week. So this is particularly concerning in areas of deprivation, and we've seen a real deepening in existing inequalities in health and well-being and education, also exacerbated by COVID. So interventions and initiatives delivered during this time in school, if you can click on please, Mallory, they've had a minimal impact on physical activity. So they've really just been sticking plasters to the problem, but the holes have gotten bigger and also more difficult to plug. And so there's a big gap that exists now between what we know works around promoting physical activity in school and actually what's done in practice. And what we need really is a new bucket. And what we need is to try and start to fix the system. So you can click on please, Mallory. So in 2019, Andy led a process which actually brought together 50 UK and international stakeholders to participate in an idea generation workshop to inform the development of a UK-based whole school physical activity approach. So this group that you can see pictured here included teachers, head teachers, active school coordinators, public health specialists, Sport England local delivery pilots, and also national organisations and researchers. So they contributed to this final design on the right-hand side here, which consists of all the different multiple components needed to create a whole school, whole systems approach to promoting physical activity. And if we recognise that if we want to change behaviour, if we want to actually increase physical activity levels in school, we need to influence multiple levels of the system. You can click on, please, Mallory. So just to talk you through the framework in a little bit more detail, if you can click on. We have at the bottom half of the framework, it outlines the different in-school factors, so the environment, the stakeholders, and also the opportunities. While the top half of the framework actually depicts the wider system beyond the individual school level. So you have things there like national policy. The cornerstone of the Creating Active School framework is policy, is this purple section here that you can see. And this really drives practice within the school, the whole school ethos and practice. And this informs the beliefs, customs, values, principles of the school around physical activity. So this really is the starting point for any school wanting to implement change. You can click on, please. The next section that we have is the environments, and this is both the social environment of the school, which reflects the degree to which the different stakeholders, the teachers, the pupils are supportive of physical activity and promoting physical activity, but also the physical environment as well. So the structures and the quality of the spaces and resources available to promote physical activity within the school. We then have, if you can click on, please, the stakeholders. So operating within those environments, the 5 key stakeholder groups within the school, which include school staff, young people, parents, guardians, and the wider stakeholders as well. So external providers that may be coming into the school. And next, please, Mallory, we also have the 7 different opportunity areas. So opportunities throughout the school day and beyond for children and young people to be physically active. So essentially what we have here with the framework is a nice colourful picture on the page. And the next step for us was to think about how we can translate it into practice and actually develop the implementation model. You can click on, please. Thank you. So creating active schools, what makes it really unique is that it's underpinned by behaviour change theory, and at all parts of the model, what we're trying to do through the implementation model is enhance the capability, the opportunity, and also the motivation of those school stakeholders that operate within the school context. So how this works is through a 4-step annual cycle. And importantly, schools go through a period of onboarding where they build a relationship with that locality level with the school. They then crucially review the school's approach to physical activity. And that process starts with an online profiling tool that schools complete with the help of the Creating Active School champion, CAS champion. That profile tool then gives them information, objective information on the school physical activity provision that schools can then select and prioritise different evidence-based solutions as part of their action planning process. They're then supported through the Creating Active Schools process with the CAS champion to carry out and implement different actions that the profiling tool has suggested may be useful. They're then encouraged as well through a monitoring and evaluation process embedded within that cycle to review and reflect on how they are achieving their improvements in provision. And again, it continues through that annual cycle. Next slide, please, Mallory. So CAS operates on a cascade model of support, working at both a national, locality and school level to build communities of practice. Starting at the top, and I know I'm slightly running over time, so I'm going to speed through this. We have the CAS national team. They're research and implementation leads and also the national coordinator for Creating Active Schools. They assist with localities to train Creating Active School champions. And those localities then subsequently also work locally with schools to recruit schools and recruit in-school Creating Active School leads. Next slide, please, Mallory. So to bring this all together and really to sum up the big picture in terms of how Creating Active Schools fulfills a unique niche is that it promotes a data-driven decision-making at all different levels of the system. What we have now within the national picture is 170 schools that have signed up and using the Creating Active School framework. At the locality level, that provides local data around the provision that schools are engaging with and where there may be gaps, where there may be similarities and strengths. That then also feeds into a national picture. So we can start to build and develop a really strong database of actually the provision that schools are offering to children and young people, which can help inform and guide policy-making decisions. And then at an international level, we're also starting to see other countries that are interested in developing Creating Active Schools to help support school-based physical activity provision. Next slide, please, Mallory. So this is really just the start of an exciting journey, which has been trailblazed by schools in Bradford and is led by a small but mighty team. And I'd encourage anybody that is interested to get in touch and please post questions within the chat box. Happy to talk further. But I shall hand over now to Zoe, who'll talk a little bit more about the work that's being done specifically in Bradford. So if you can click on another 3 times, I think, please, Mallory. And one more, great.
Yeah, I was just about to start talking and realised I was on mute, so that's a good start. Moving forwards for a presentation. So I'm Zoe. I am evaluating the impact and implementation of the Creating Active Schools programme. I'm purely looking at Bradford, so whilst at the moment this is being rolled out on a national level, as Anna was talking about, I'm purely looking at Bradford, and this means that they do have their own sort of little things going on. So I know that is it termly, a big CAS conference where all the schools get together and create this community of practice. It's just one example of what's going on in Bradford, and other localities will have their own models, and each school is able to take on the CAS programme and adapt it in their own way, which is really, really special about the CAS programme, but also makes it very difficult to evaluate, as we found out. So if you just click on one slide, please. So our approach, and I think this picture sums it up quite nicely. There is no one approach that has meant we can move forward with this evaluation. So we're trying to understand the organisational changes that are being made within schools. But as every school is different, there's no linear method to understanding this. So we're kind of looking at different approaches so that we can gather this holistic understanding of the changes that are going on. And so we're first of all, if you just click on through one slide, looking at the organisational changes to physical activity provision. So we're looking at, we're using a questionnaire to measure this, and we're looking at when schools first began or before they began, where they're at in terms of their physical activity provision. And this covers domains that are identified on that original CAS framework. So regarding policy, stakeholders, environments and opportunities. We've also underpinned it with the COMBI model of behaviour change, and this is actually the first time that a whole school approach has been underpinned with behavioural theory, so that's really exciting and kind of gives us that novel understanding of whole school approaches. So we had 53 schools complete this at baseline, we've had 32 at follow-up. And there's a couple of example questions on there. So it was all done using a Likert scale. The second one that's on there, I know it's numbered number 1 and I've put it second. That doesn't make sense. But that's an example of a question aligning with the capability aspect of the COMBI model. So if we just click on, there's some findings that we've already found, which is really exciting. There's a paper being written at the moment that hopefully will be sent out for published next week or editing next week. So what have we found so far? You can see all these different areas. So we have seen organisational changes to physical activity provision, and there's all these domains within that have actually shown that 9 months of the CAS programme has had an impact on. So whole school culture and ethos, and that's including things like policies and strategies in place, academic lessons, physical environments, teachers and wider school staff. Academic lessons is on there twice. Obviously had a big impact. But we're also seeing a change through behaviour as well. So we've actually seen for all stakeholders or all stakeholder groups that have been identified on the original framework, we've seen a change in capability, motivation and opportunity regarding physical activity provision. So that's a huge finding, and we need to continue this research so we can see if this is sustainable. So hopefully in a year's time, we can repeat the measure and again in another year's time. So we're seeing if these are sustainable changes and if we're continuing to see increases in this change, and if we're changing even more domains or having an impact in even more domains. We're also, though, this is kind of the base of what we're looking into. And this allows us to identify some outcomes to make inferences for future research. And whilst we're seeing change, we aren't able through this to depict where we're seeing change. So alongside this, we've been running ripple effects mapping. And if you just click onto the next slide, please. Perfect. We've been running ripple effects mapping, and we're doing this collectively with 16 schools in Bradford that began their journey in September 2021. And we're doing 3 sessions over the next 2 years to kind of identify what's been going on and what schools are implementing, engaging with, and what the success and ripples of that has been. So the best way that I describe ripple effects mapping is if you drop a stone into a body of water and you look at the ripples that have come off that. So for example, if a school completed the profiling tool, what has come from that? They then identified 4 areas of impact areas that they needed to focus on. They decided that the, I don't know, environment, the hall was something that they needed to change, or that break and lunch times was something that they needed to focus on. So then they spoke to the children about that, and they identified that football, girls wanted football, and so on and so forth. And it's all those tiny discussions and reflections and all those little ripples, and we're able to see really what impact the Creating Active Schools program is having. So on the screen is one example of a school's map, and this is crazy to think the school has done all of this within 9 months or 8 months, I think this was, of a program. And it also enables us to set goals for the schools and identify any barriers and facilitators that the schools have faced. So if you just click forward again, we're then going to be using the framework method. Oh, 2 minutes to go. I'll rush through again. The framework method of analysis. And this enables us to draw comparisons across all of the schools. So ripple effects mapping, whilst it's been used before, actually hasn't been used in such a number of schools. As the analysis will take us some time, but it will really allow us to delve down into what areas of the CAS framework are being implemented, are being engaged with, and are being successful. So you can see on there, I've taken one ripple from the map on the previous slide, and I've highlighted where there's been mentions of stakeholders and where there's been mentions of opportunities. And from that, we'll be able to draw comparisons between each schools and look at the overall impact. If you just click on again. So yeah, moving forwards, we need to repeat the organisational change questionnaire. We need to understand that sustainability aspect of the changes that we're seeing, and if there's significant changes, because some other areas that weren't on that previous slide have been identified to see change, but it's not been significant or had a large effect, and therefore in time, is this change being continued? Will it become a significant change? We're also going to continue with ripple effects mapping. So far we've done session 1 with 10 schools, so we've got quite a long way to go, quite a mountain to climb with ripple effects mapping, but that's really exciting data coming up there, and really exciting analysis ahead. And we will finally then be doing an assessment of accelerometry. So we've already done the baseline of this, but the follow-up will be in 2 years' time as well, and we'll be looking at assessing the impact of the CAS programme on physical activities, so that outcome behaviour that we're ultimately trying to change within children. I think there's one more slide, but just to say thank you for listening. I hope that last bit wasn't too quick. I think am I passing on? Sorry, yeah, passing on to Jade.
Thanks, Zoe. So hi everyone, I'm Jade Morris. I'm a postdoc research fellow at the University of Bradford, and I'm going to be talking to you something slightly different to the Creating Active Schools framework, and talking to you about a Sport England funded project around developing a tool to assess physical literacy in children and young people in both education and community sport settings. Next slide, please, Mallory. So to kind of get started, for those of you that don't know, wanted to kind of review what physical literacy is and why it is so important. And so kind of to caveat this, in the first instance, there is still kind of not a consensus around the definition for physical literacy. And that's something we've experienced nationally, but also internationally. And so at the moment, there is another project that's being done to kind of come up with a consensus definition for England around what physical literacy is. So you can see on the left of the screen here, there's quite a few different definitions for what it is, but broadly, we know that it's around engagement in movement and physical activity across the life course. So from the beginning of your life all the way up to being an older adult. And it's about those different ways that you might engage and how that kind of has peaks and troughs during your life. And so why is it so important? Well, we know it's really important because some of the data from the Active Life Survey from Sport England has actually found that physical literacy is vital to children and young people's physical activity levels. And as Anna highlighted in her presentation, we know that children are not meeting the physical activity guidelines. And so we need to be doing anything we can to improve children's physical activity levels. So research by Sport England also found children that were deemed physically literate were likely to do twice as much physical activity. And this linked into enjoying it, having the confidence, the competence, but also that understanding and knowledge around being physically active in different environments. So if we can identify the needs or assess the levels of physical literacy in children, we can then start to tailor interventions to improve their physical literacy, which will then have that knock-on effect on improving physical activity and helping us create that more active environment, using that school system as the perfect opportunity to improve physical activity. And the reason that's so important is we know that as we get older, forming positive habits like being physically active become harder and harder. So it is a critical time point to focus on physical literacy. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, the term physical literacy can mean a lot of different things to people and organisations in the different sectors. Next slide, please, Mallory. So something that we need to think about is how can we get that consensus on what physical literacy is, because that is critical for us to think about how we can then assess physical literacy. So as I mentioned, there's some work already ongoing. We actually had a co-creation stakeholder event last week in Birmingham, where we were coming together similar to the development of the Creating Active Schools framework to hash out different ideas with people from education, health and sports sectors, mixing practitioners and researchers to really understand what does physical literacy mean to them and how can we get consensus on the definition. And so this is really important because when we can understand what kind of the key principles are and how important the different domains of physical literacy are, so that's kind of your social, physical, cognitive domains, we can start to unpick how we would then assess it. So next slide, please. And so the project that I'm leading on has 4 different stages to it for how we will have this end result of the physical literacy assessment tool. And so briefly, this is stage 1 is looking at a review of reviews. So looking at all of the existing literature on physical literacy assessment tools and identifying what tools have worked and what tools we might want to build on to have a more successful kind of use in the future, thinking about validity, but also feasibility. Stage 2 is thinking about the people that will be using this tool or who we envision that will use it, so teachers and coaches, and conducting a survey online to understand what the facilitators and barriers are for them to use it. So there's no point us identifying a tool that is never going to be used. So we need to break down those barriers to ensure that it has use in these practical settings that we're hoping it will. The next 2 stages is kind of broken into 2 parts. So the first one is similar to what we're doing with the definition work, is having another multi-stakeholder event to co-create the new physical literacy tool. So we will draw on the experience from the scoping review and from children's insights to identify what this new tool should look like. How should we be assessing the different aspects? And what should the format of that tool be in terms of the assessment, whether that's online, in person, a self-reported questionnaire? We don't know yet, but that's what we need to work out when we're thinking about delivering it to a group of children at once. And the second part to this stage is around talking to children. If they're the kind of end user of the product, we need to make sure that they're involved in this process. So we want to talk to them before the co-creation event to gain their insights on their preference to assessment types. But actually after we've had the event and we think we've got an assessment tool, we want to reach out to them again to see what they like about it and what they don't like to ensure they're part of that development process. And then finally, the last stage is actually to pilot the test. So assess validity and look at feasibility, test it in some schools and just see what's coming out already. Next slide, please, Mallory. So briefly, and I know I'm just got 2 minutes left for time, I just wanted to kind of tell you a little bit more about the scoping review. This is the stage that we've already done before we move on to the stages 2, 3, and 4. So we had 3 aims with the scoping review. And for those that don't know, the scoping review we've done is a review of existing systematic review. So it's a review of reviews. And the reason we've done it like this is to be more effective of our time, given there are a lot of reviews out there already. And we just really want to get the key headlines of what is working in terms of the physical literacy tools and what's not working. And we break this down into kind of 2 categories. So the second aim, which is one of the categories, is focusing on tools that are reliable, accurate, and validity. So making sure that it is robust, making sure that time and time again we'd get the same results. So that's one of the key areas that we need to focus on. The second key area is actually thinking about feasibility with the tool in an education and community sport setting. And the problem, I think, with a lot of the tools is that they are not focusing on both of these 2 different aspects. Next slide, please, Mallory. So what we found so far is we've got 4 reviews that have been included. And we found while 3 of the 4 reviews are looking at kind of the psychometric properties. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking at the moment, he's just got back from a walk. So if that's a noise coming up, apologies for that. So 3 of the 4 reviews have looked at risk of bias, which is really positive. However, we found only 1 of the 4 reviews has assessed feasibility. So the capacity of the teachers or coaches, the time, the equipment, the resources. And kind of digging into this a little deeper, the tools that are coming out as the most robust in terms of reliability, validity, are lacking on feasibility, and therefore they're not going to be feasible to assess a group of 30 children at once. And that's something that we need to work on in the development of our tool, is ensuring that it meets these criteria of being robust, but actually is something that teachers can practically use moving forward. And my final slide, please, Mallory. So just to kind of reiterate to everyone here on the call today, we're still in the early stages of this project, but there's a lot of opportunities for any teachers and coaches on this call if you want to get involved. My details, you've got my email address on the screen, but next year we'll be having this co-creation event in spring. There's opportunities to have your say if you want to take part in our survey, or even if you want your school, your pupils to be a part of this process, we'd love to have you involved. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities out there. And I'm going to finish it there and say thanks very much and hand over to Liam.
Thanks very much, Jade. I feel under a little bit of pressure here because I've been keeping time for other people and I've now got to keep time myself. So my presentation is talking, kind of building on the work that Zoe and Anna have talked about at the beginning, looking at a particular opportunity for increasing physical activity within the school day. So if we go back to the CAS framework, and there were these 7 opportunity areas for increasing physical activity, the area that my work is specifically looking at the moment is ways of increasing physical activity within curricular lesson time. And there's a number of different kind of reasons or arguments why we might want to focus on that. Some of them I can, ask me about later, and I can go into a bit more detail. But some of the perhaps most pertinent ones are that physical activity levels during a school day are usually at their lowest during curriculum time, and therefore it's a quite meaty section of the day to be focusing on potentially trying to boost physical activity levels in children. Next slide, please. So when we look at ways or methodologies that have been looked at previously or developed previously for increasing physical activity within lesson time, there's kind of 2 main approaches here, and those approaches kind of sit somewhere on this continuum between trying to, within curriculum time, embed and integrate physical activity into the learning that children are doing, versus what I'm going to refer to as movement breaks. Some of you might have heard of activities such as the Daily Mile, where children take 10-15 minutes after their lesson to go and run for a certain specified period of time in the playground, what have you. Those are also meant to occur within curriculum time, but obviously they occur at the expense of learning. You know, the children are being physically active rather than learning. Now, physically active learning, with Andy will talk about, or Pal, as I'll refer to it in a bit more detail in the next presentation, is kind of a wide range of approaches which can vary from kind of trying to do physical activity alongside, but not really related to the content of a lesson a child is learning, all the way up to physical activity that is directly relevant to the concepts that they're trying to learn. So maybe they're trying to learn something maybe about spaces or fractions or numeracy, and they're using maybe quantities in terms of physically moving around a space or dividing up a space whilst being physically active to try and build kind of a physical representation of maybe the more abstract concept that they're trying to learn. And there's various arguments for all of these approaches potentially having knock-on benefits, not just to children's physical activity levels, but also potentially their behavior in the classroom, their cognitive performance, and depending on other aspects as well, potentially their learning as well. Next slide, please. So we, in a specific study that we had funded by the Waterloo Foundation, wanted to look at comparing some of these different methodologies. So in previous research, people have maybe looked at physically active learning, or they've looked at movement breaks, but they haven't necessarily looked at the relative differences and the advantages of using different approaches, which when you come to something like the CAS framework and you want to choose what's going to work in my school, you want to know the pros and cons of different methods that you have available, and you can only really do that through direct comparison. So we had kind of three key research questions that we were interested in here. One was about what are the impact of these different approaches compared to traditional lessons in terms of the amount of increase of physical activity you get. A second one was what are the impacts that we see of these different lesson types? So a lesson with a movement break or a lesson that's taught in a physically active way on children's learning and their cognition. We also tried to assess behavior, but we with the funding, we couldn't quite stretch that far. And you might have three possible outcomes here. You might have an impact on learning and cognition that is negative. You're taking away from learning and cognition by trying to be more physically active. You might have positive benefits, as some previous research has suggested, or you might just have a neutral effect, that children are learning the same amount whilst being physically active. So you're kind of getting physical activity as a bonus, alongside the learning that would naturally occur anywhere in these lessons. And last of all, if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about some further research. We looked at whether there were specific benefits for children with attention difficulties in using more physically active forms of learning. Next slide, please. So briefly to outline what we did in our study, within a school, we had three classes at a particular age level. One class did a classic sedentary maths lesson. Another class did that same lesson, but it was embedded within a physically active learning context. And another class did a maths lesson sedentary for a shorter period of time, and then had a movement break at the end of it. So all were 45-minute lessons. Children wore accelerometers throughout so we could measure their physical activity levels. And we measured children's learning, cognition, and behavior before and afterwards. And just a quick thanks to, I don't know if any of the anyone from any of these schools is on the call, but these were the 4 schools that were involved in our study from Bradford. So thank you particularly to them. Next slide, please. So what we found when doing this research, so in terms of that first research question about what was the impact of these different types of interventions in curriculum time, well, as we would have hoped, the movement breaks and the physically active learning both boosted physical activity levels amongst children in those lessons compared to the sedentary lessons. Interestingly, physically active learning reduced sedentary time the most of all the three conditions of the 2 physical activity conditions. It did that largely by increasing the amount of light rather than moderate to vigorous physical activity that children were engaging in. So you kind of got extra benefits from physically active learning over and above a movement break in terms of the amount of physical activity children were engaging in. Both movement breaks and physically active learning, we were kind of surprised to see had kind of equal impacts on, or approximately equal impacts on the amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity that you often see in the guidelines. This is the kind or the type of physical activity that we want to be increasing within within individuals. And interestingly, that compared favorably in terms of the amount of increase to the amount of, thanks Jade, the amount of physical activity that children would normally get within an hour-long PE lesson. So by trying to do physically active learning within curriculum time, you were getting equivalent effects to what you get within an hour of PE in using these alternative approaches to teaching within the curriculum, which we thought was quite exciting. Next slide, please. So the next thing that we looked at was those influences on learning and cognition, and some other studies that have used maybe less rigorous methodologies have kind of proposed that there are kind of positive knock-on secondary benefits in these areas. We didn't actually see this in our study. What we found was, irrespective of which lesson the child was doing, their cognitive levels were roughly comparable before and after, and also their performance on a maths fluency assessment, which was our learning outcome here, was pretty stable again before and after. So we actually didn't see any evidence really of learning, so it's difficult to say if it impacted on learning as such. But what we can say with certainty here is certainly children aren't being detrimentally impacted in terms of these important outcomes for learning, if you're trying to increase physical activity during these times using either physically active learning or a movement break. What we probably need, though, is a longer, a longer study that looks at the impact of physically active learning or movement breaks over a much longer extended period of time within these schools, because we looked at a single one-off intervention across a day. Okay, so I'm aware I'm kind of at time there, so I'm going to stop. If anyone does want to ask me at the end in the question time about the final research question, which is the next slide, about impact specifically in children with attentional difficulties, please do. This is much more cautious. I think these slides are available as well after the presentation, so all of that's there. And just a big thanks to the team. And if you want to, again, use the slide to scan to land on our webpage. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Liam, I was going to say, I think we've got time. So if you want to go back to that slide, please do take
a
minute.
Great, cool. Well, let's do that then. Cool. So this last slide, we were looking at children within our sample of about 400 children. All of the children completed all of the teachers of these children completed a questionnaire measuring attention difficulty symptomology, so attention deficit hyperactivity symptoms. And what we observed in our sample is that as these symptoms became more severe, so in children with more severe symptoms, the typical pattern we would see in a standard lesson is they would perform more poorly on the post-tests after the lesson than they would on the pre-tests before the lesson. So you would see what we hypothesize here is a kind of deterioration in their ability to maintain their attention over the course of our study, which I think we could all say is quite predictable. If you have attention difficulties, maintaining your attentive performance over an hour is likely to be more harder than for you if you have ADHD or ADHD symptoms than a child who doesn't. Interestingly, and this was very small numbers because we weren't looking specifically at kind of recruiting individuals with clinically diagnosed attention disorder, in the groups where we had physical activity embedded in their lessons, children didn't seem to show that tailing off. So we have a kind of working hypothesis here. Again, we need to go back and probably do a study that's more targeted and looking specifically at children with attention difficulties and how within curriculum time physical activity impacts on them. But within our study, just looking within a general population at some individuals who had these difficulties in our sample, it seems like increased physical activity helps individuals with attention difficulties stay on task and maintain their performance on cognitive and learning outcomes better than in a standard traditional lesson. So there might be some knock-on benefits, particularly in that group. And we know, for example, in children with ADHD, that exercise therapies are particularly effective in kind of clinical therapeutic settings at helping some of those children alleviate some of their symptoms. So alongside drug therapies and other forms of cognitive behavioral therapies, exercise is really useful at helping alleviate some of the symptoms that children with ADHD experience. And we might be seeing a kind of knock-on or a reflection of this in our results here. Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Liam. And I'll take over. So on to the final part of the presentation. So this is just a quick whistle-stop tour of a European project that is tying into the work around creating active schools and physically active learning. It's been run out of Norway by the university that Anna works for and I work for as a visiting associate professor. But it's across 6 European countries. And we set out within this project to develop a European teacher training program for physically active learning, but also some free teacher training modules for both qualified teachers and student teachers. If you click to the next slide, please. So why did we need that? Well, what we see generally within the research around physically active learning, and what we know when we look at adoption of programs into schools, that they generally tend to focus on innovators and early adopters. And the innovators are the people who will always pick up new ideas, and they generally will make those new ideas work. But unfortunately, they don't represent the largest body of teachers, which sit in the early and late majority. So with Activate, what we focused on is understanding what the teachers value, because quite often we make the mistake as health researchers of expecting that teachers value what we want them to focus on. And that's not always the case. So we're trying to understand what is it that teachers value and how can we align physical activity or physical active learning with that? And second, how do we create more supportive programs that take the onus away from the teacher, but provide them with a large amount of resource and support to enable these programs to happen? So next slide, please. So overviewing the Activate project, this 6 work packages. So this was funded by an Erasmus Plus grant when we used to be part of the European Union. And we focused on, the first stage of this was to review the current literature to understand what the core competencies are that are required for teachers to become effective PAL practitioners. The next stage, which was the work package 2, was to look at what measures do teachers actually value in terms of understanding, if we do physically active learning, understanding the impact of that within their classrooms. Those two combined together to help us develop a teacher training curriculum. So because if we're going to start to change the way people do things, we need to be able to identify what it is that they need to change and then develop training around those learning outcomes. These were then activated in 2 ways. First of all, we developed the Activate web portal, which you can find at activateyourclass.eu. And then sat on that portal, which is work package 5, are 2 e-learning packages. We've got 1 e-learning package for qualified teachers and 1 for student teachers. Finally, in the final work package, which we're just drawing to a close at this moment in time as the project ends in December, is an evaluation of these initial teacher training modules to understand teachers' experiences and students' experiences of using them to help improve their performance. Next stage, please. Oh, sorry, next slide. So this is just a piece of work that we did with myself and Jade led, and obviously with the whole Activate team, where we did something called a meta synthesis. So that was to look through all of the research that understood teachers' barriers and facilitators to implementing or delivering physically active learning. And you can see that there's a number of major themes that appeared within this. First of all, we looked at, working at the bottom right, we looked at things like what factors affect their ability to deliver physically active learning or integrate that within their teaching. A lot of this associated with actually being able to plan and understand how you integrate physical activity effectively. The next theme was looking at teachers' beliefs about their own capabilities. And what we found here was actually teachers do use physically active learning. It's maybe not labeled like that. And actually, in order to build their confidence, we need to help them and build up their awareness of their own competence that currently exists. Next, we looked at resources in terms of how we support teachers, both from a time perspective, but also what materials we can provide to enable teachers to deliver physical active learning. And then beyond this, we're looking at things like the whole school approach, because quite often we see that teachers operate in isolation, especially if they're innovators or early adopters, and they need to actually move beyond isolated teachers to build effective communities of practice. And how do we support those developments of those communities of practice, and what's the role of senior leaders? If you want to know more, you can access the paper, which is linked into the slides. Next slide, please. So alongside this, we interviewed 18 PAL pioneers. That's 6 teachers, 6 teacher trainers, and 6 researchers from across the globe. This was done virtually during the COVID pandemic. And we developed something called the PAL Learning Journey. This is split into two main phases. One is the onboarding process, and the second is a process of gradual growth. And what we found through this research is actually when you look at the onboarding process, current teacher training methods around PAL are nowhere near comprehensive. They tend to be one-day courses that are not substantial enough in terms of shifting the initial behaviour. So there's a much greater need, if you look in that first kind of square on the left-hand side of the picture, to understand teachers' initial mindsets, what their values are as teachers, before we then start to build to make PAL meaningful and help to establish initial capability. As we move to the right-hand side, which is the process of gradual growth, it's a cycle of planning something, having a go and reviewing what happens, and that taking a small step-by-step approach to increasing, making sure that we start simple, we build in small steps and move towards advanced practice. A key element of this is helping teachers to learn how to manage the behaviour of pupils beyond traditional classroom settings, and this is seen as quite a large fear that if things go wrong, teachers are known to drop out and not have another go. Especially based on the sort of pressures from their colleagues and the educational system. There's always a feeling of, I always need to get what I do right. And that links into supporting teachers to adopt a growth mindset and also reflective practice. All of this is featured in the Activate European Physically Active Learning Teacher Training Curriculum, which you can find on the activateyourclass.eu website, freely available for people to download. So whether you're a school, whether you're an educational provider, we'd strongly recommend that you download this curriculum because it can help shape your future teacher training efforts. Next slide, please. So in terms of how all of this comes together, and you can just click through these for me, Mallory, if you don't mind. We've got the background, which is the research that feeds into the curriculum. The curriculum feeds into the 2 e-learning courses. And within each e-learning course, we've got 3 modules. So there's the onboarding module, which is about getting started. There's the next steps, which is actually beginning to deliver PAL. And then the final module is building to becoming a more advanced practitioner, where you're working at the more autonomous level. So as I keep reinforcing, if you are interested in this, please go to the activateyourclass.eu website and feel free to access the modules. They're there to be used in any way you see fit. So if you're a higher education provider, as an example, you can take the modules, put them into your university modules, use things as directed activities, and so on and so forth. But if you would like to know more, please do get in touch. If you could click onto the last slide, please, Mallory. So that draws to the end the series of presentations. We do have 5 or 6 minutes for any questions if people would like to pose questions to any of the speakers. I'm not sure whether I can actually see them or not. Mallory, can you help us in terms of questions from the audience?
So I am not currently seeing any questions in the Q&A yet.
Fantastic. Right. Well, I'll get started then, because I love asking questions. So I'm aware that we had quite a research-based focus. So I'm going to go through each panelist, starting with Anna, and then working through the others. Moving away from your research, what would you advise to a school is the next step they could take to influence physical activity within their particular school? So Anna, I'm going to put you on the spot. So what's your response?
Just say that again.
How would you advise schools to get started with school-based physical activity?
Oh, I think the first thing would be to really reflect and look at what they're already providing. And we know from the work that we've done creating active schools that actually engaging and getting senior management team support and having them on board is really key and really crucial. So I think if they are willing, I think having a really open and honest reflection in terms of where they're already at with their provision is really useful. And then obviously using things like the Creating Active School framework to map on and see where they may be missing, where there may be gaps, where they may be wanting to develop different areas of provision, I think is probably the starting point.
Great, thank you. Zoe, over to you. I was about to call you Lucy for some reason. Zoe,
That's so typical. I was literally about to say, reflect on what you're doing. And then I thought, and then Anna said that. So I thought, oh, senior leaders. And then Anna said that. And I was like, ah, right, I'm stuck now. But I think as well, something I've learned as alongside senior leaders being on board and being a driving force for change, so is policy. And actually, if there's changes made at the policy level, whilst yes, you need to reflect on what's already in place and what's already working, what we need to de-implement, etc., etc. If changes are made at that policy level, it does feed down into the other stakeholders involved and throughout environments, whatever it is. So I would also suggest a review on current physical activity policy and see if it's even out there on like the school website and through communication means, so that parents are aware of it, and see who is aware of that policy and if it's actually having the impact that it's intended to have.
So I think that's a really good message, and there's probably two levels to policy, but I think the one you're focusing on is school level policy. So that's looking at things like your teaching and learning strategies,
Yeah.
school development plans, ensuring physical activities integrated.
Yeah,
with that.
well, we know that schools can't impact the higher level policy in terms of, but if you're an individual school, just look at their own physical activity policies that are in place and review them.
Great, thank you very much. Jade, your turn.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm going to keep it a bit more simplistic, I think, actually, and a bit more accessible for a lot of people. And actually just think about what other schools are doing. There's so much out there on Twitter and other social media platforms where you could arrange to go to another school and visit and see what their physical activity practice looks like, or get some learning lessons from other schools, seeing what works for them, especially if you haven't maybe got senior leadership team on board yet. Perhaps seeing what other schools are doing, take some of those ideas, see what works for you, because it won't always be, it's not a one size fits all. And then once you can start to see some of those small positive changes, that might then help you get the SLT on board.
Great, thank you, Jade. And last but not least, Liam.
Andy, yeah, I noticed there's also another really interesting question in the chat as well. I mean, I've had a lot of the good answers hoovered up already, haven't I? So I think my reflection on listening to all of them, and I think that's brilliant advice, is we've talked a little bit about the capability and the opportunity to change behavior. And we maybe the thing that hasn't really been touched upon yet is the motivation, and maybe that speaks to the other question in the Q&A as well. I think from someone who personally works pretty much on physically active learning, I'm interested in physical activities generally, but I'm not going to there's far better people qualified on this call than me to talk on a broader spectrum. I think understanding what should motivate you to consider physical activity, going and checking those materials on activateyourclass.eu will give you a real understanding of the benefits. That onboarding process that Andy talked about is really, I think, fundamentally important in understanding why physical activity and physical activity within a curriculum setting can be really important and really beneficial. So yeah, I would say kind of engage with understanding what your motivations are for being physically active. And if you're talking within my context of physically active learning, do that maybe through going and looking at activateyourclass.eu. And some of the materials they have.
Great, thank you very much, Liam. And I'll take the question that's been asked so that I'm under pressure. So how can we support schools? We are lobbying on your behalf. So Bradford is seen as one of the shining lights in terms of school-based physical activity. We have a very, very strong infrastructure due to work of CAER and also through the Bradford Opportunity Area with the Living Well partnership, where there's Living Well schools working across the city to support schools in health and well-being. We've had the DFE up to visit back in May, and we're now seeing through the work in Bradford that creating active schools is hopefully going to start to appear at a national level in some of the guidance documents. So we are lobbying at that highest level. In terms of how we create effective change, and this comes back to Anna's slide on a data-driven system, we've got a really unique opportunity with CAS that where schools are profiling, that data is not just being used for the school, it's been taken up and used throughout the system. So the more schools that adopt CAS, use that tool to reflect, will increase the population that's then been fed back up to a national level. So the plan for us is to write a national report every year to go up to DFE, up to the Department of Health, to start to leverage how funding is being provided around this particular agenda. And we don't say that lightly. We know tough times are ahead. To be honest, I think we've been in tough times for the last 2, 3, 4 years. We will do everything we can, and we will work alongside you. And I think there's strong evidence of that at the moment in terms of, for example, on Friday, I know Zoe talked about conferences. We've got over 40 schools attending a Creating Active Schools conference in Bradford through the JUMP programme and the Living Well programme combined. We are looking to then roll that out across the city from the next school year and beyond. So please keep your eyes open for the various opportunities. I can see we've hit 5:30. So unless there are any more pressing questions that people would like to ask, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their time and dedication, not just for their presentations, but for the research they're doing and the support that they're providing schools. I'd like to thank our attendees. Hope you have found this that is an hour well spent. And if you haven't attended live, maybe you're watching this back, please do get in touch if you would like to know more or connect with any of the research team. So without further ado, we'll say goodbye and yeah, hopefully hear from people soon.